In the 1950s, Scottish psychiatrist Ewan Cameron for the CIA conducted electroshock therapy experiments. These shock therapy experiments were meant to return troubled patients to a blank slate so he could write a new personality for them. Well, this same concept was brought up to the macro level to impose neoliberal economic policies in countries around the world. This concept is called the Shock Doctrine, and it is a theory for explaining the way that force, stealth, and crisis are used in implementing neoliberal economic policies such as privatization, deregulation, and cuts to social services. One of the earliest examples of this is a case of Pinochet's regime in the 1980s of Chile. The story of developing governments in the 20th century was choosing between the hell of the fascistic right and the socialist left. Of all the political examples of this ideological dialectic, for Latin America, the best example is Chile. So everything changed in Chile in 1970 when Salvador Allende was elected president. As a Marxist physician and member of Chile's Socialist Party, the head of the Unidad Popular, Allende won a plurality of votes in the presidential election, winning 36% against 35 and 28%. After a series of policies such as nationalization of copper, socializing the national economy, and collectivization, inflation reached 140% per annum, which enraged members in the government and the military. On September 11, 1973, a coup backed by the CIA overthrew Allende and placed Augusto Pinochet in power. This caused 17 years of a brutal regime. However, Milton Friedman have stated that Pinochet used a shock doctrine, which is a forced crisis in implementing economic policies after periods of disorientation, like a coup. So, the miracle in Chile was a term coined by Friedman talking about how Pinochet improved the economy drastically and caused Chile to be one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America. However, Pinochet's violations of human rights and like forced disappearances, tortures, and murders may not have justified the means. This leads to my question on how were the effects of the shock doctrine felt throughout Chile during and after Pinochet's regime, and do the ends really justify the means? After the overthrow of Allende with support from the United States, Pinochet's regime caused short-term failure in the economy and also committed horrific human rights violations. Thus, his shock doctrine did more harm than good, which shows that the ends did not justify the means. So, firstly, the failure of Allende's economic policy contributed to the overthrow of his government. If we compare Pinochet's regime and Allende's economic policy, the main difference is that Pinochet suffered early on, as Allende imposed state-mandated employment, which did not net any real wealth or productivity, but instead dragged the economy to a halt. It was short-lived and gross investment fell by 16% his reign. Inflation hit hard to over 140 per annum. As a comparison, the current US inflation is 1.8%. In the graph, you can see that the country could not provide enough food, so the government had to look for other countries for exports. So you can see that huge imports. In the next slide, it shows the march of the pots and pans. They were banging on empty pots and pans to send a message to Allende that the economy has come to the haltsies, caused a decline of the economy in the short term during his years as president, but set an economic precedent later on. During Pinochet's regime, 48% of Chileans lived on poverty. In addition, the banking crisis of 1982 demonstrated the failure of his economic policies. It was one of the worst economic crises in Chile. The gross domestic product dropped by 14%, and the official unemployment rose to over a third of the labor force. The government had around 16 billion in foreign loans. As you can see in the first graph, the huge decline of the rate of the growth of GDP was during Pinochet's regime, and when he implemented his economic policies, the GDP retracted 14.3%. Unemployment rose to 23.7%, and in 1985, the Chilean foreign debt peaked at around 21 billion. So that's why they had to prioritize exports in order to meet its loan payments. However, a drop of the price of oil and decreased shipping costs caused recovery after 1985. So there are also refutations against this argument. The Chilean miracle is argued because of the strong growth in the economy after 1985. Although Pinochet's regime caused drastic decline of the economy during the short term, some argue that his economic policies caused long-term prosperity for Chile. Even Alejandro Foxley, the foreign minister today, said, "We may not like the government that came before us, but they did manage to make many things correct. We have inherited an economy that is an asset." Pinochet's Chile in 1975 was the first to break away from socialism, and extreme state capitalism set the precedent for policies later on. Even if it may not be the correlation that there's economic prosperity in the future, but even though if there is, the short-term effects of the economy outweighs the benefits. And also, was his way morally correct? Furthermore, Pinochet's shock doctrine caused immoral tactics towards opposition, which created human rights violations towards its own citizens. Murders, forced disappearances, and torture are just a few of many cases of what Pinochet did to its people. According to the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation, the number of direct victims to the human rights violation is around 30,000 people. 27,000 people were tortured, and 3,000 people were executed. Around 200,000 people suffered exile and illegal detention. Systematic human rights violations were imposed by the government, including physical and sexual abuse and psychological damage to its citizens. Pinochet later then scrapped this constitution and had to limit democracy. He then censored the press, banned labor strikes and unions, and finally in 1980, Pinochet's regime backed a new constitution. So later in a 1988 plebiscite, Pinochet was elected out of office with 44% of the votes. So this is a horror story described by one of the soldiers in the Pinochet regime. One former Chilean soldier said that he shot 10 people in the head and then blew up their bodies with dynamite. Another said his platoon drenched 2 teens with gasoline and set them on fire. He said he was an army veteran and recounted taking several people to the desert, shooting them in the head and blowing up their bodies. Not even their shadows were left, said the man, who expressed regret about killing at least 18 people in various incidents. This really shows the drastic violations the Pinochet regime caused. Although it could be argued that Pinochet's regime policy later formed a framework for economic prosperity in Chile, his shock doctrine did more harm than good because of the human rights violations and short-term failures of the economy. Allende's policy in theory created equality among the people. However, in practice, there were many problems such as loss of food and hyperinflation, which caused hunger and the halt of the economy. After U.S. intervention in the coup, Pinochet's economic policy caused a human rights violation and a sharp increase of unemployment. This also shows the failure of U.S. involvement and involvement of colonial powers. If the U.S. have not contributed to the coup, Pinochet's regime may not have gotten its support and may not have gotten in power. So the ends did not really justify the means due to the human rights violations and the short-term failures of the economy. Historical memory is critical to look at to prevent the future mistakes. By looking at past failures, we can learn from the mistakes and prevent similar future events from happening. Capitalism this time failed the people of Chile. The shock doctrine hurt innocent children, women, and men, changing their lives forever. Many people lost their loved ones and suffered through. We must reflect on these atrocities that happened in the past to ensure that our future children and our future people will not experience the same fate. I want to end with a story. Carlos Reyes Manzo is one of the many thousands who were detained and tortured by the Pinochet regime. Zunica says the torturers were mentally prepared to torture because they felt like they were defending their country. It was impossible for them to believe that what they were doing was wrong. This is the kind of ideology when you're convinced that people have the right to torture, right to kill, right to rape the woman, right to do whatever they did, and that it was right. He shakes his head and says that was incredible. Thank you.